Alright, and hello everyone, my name is JungleBook1. I am a North American challenger and competitive player, and today I'm going to be talking about how to position each of the 5 cost units. The 5 costs in this set are so crucial because they are essential to capping out really any endgame board, and understanding how to get the most value out of each and every one is really going to help you win more games. So let's hop right into it. So first we're going to start with Ornn. And by the way, just a general note before I really dive into it is I'm going to be talking about the spell that each of these units has, and really just understanding exactly what the spell does and what value it provides is important, because then it gives context to how you might want to be positioning it. So let's begin. So first we're going to begin with Ornn. Ornn summons an elemental from behind the farthest enemy, and it chills all enemies' hits for 3 seconds. That deals magic damage, and then he redirects it and does a little bit of extra damage as well. So how do you want to position him? I would say in general, Ornn, if you have no items on him, he is not the best or tankiest unit ever. So you kind of want to keep him safe and tucked away, like maybe in one of the middle hexes of your front line. And what I mean by that is, if I summon some training dummies, you can just imagine there are other miscellaneous frontline units. What this will do is these units will draw the aggro from the corner before Ornn, essentially letting Ornn build up a bit more mana from auto attacking or taking damage from some other tanks, and then he will be more likely to at least get a cast off. So his spell does summon the elemental behind the furthest enemy, meaning if you want to get the value out of the damage, but more importantly, the chill effect of his ability, it's important to put him offset to the left or right, depending on where the enemy carry is. So if the enemy has a carry in the upper right corner, then you will prefer to lean him to the left side, because then you're more likely to cast and chill their carry in the upper right. And of course, the opposite is also true, where if their carry is in the upper left corner, you will place him somewhere around A5 or A6. So that is usually what you want to be thinking about when you're playing Ornn. Now, if you do have Ornn 2 with like multiple artifacts and he's super tanky, of course you're going to want to be thinking more in the context of keeping him in front of your backline carries to keep them safe. So obviously his positioning may change with context to what your board is looking like and what his items are, and just the general composition of your board. But in general, try to think about sniping the enemy carry with the chill effect of his spell. Alright, next we have Fiddlesticks. Let me just remove these target dummies, they may come back later. So Fiddlesticks, I'm also going to remove the Ornn now. Fiddlesticks is a 2-hex unit, you will notice. Here it says under Magic Assassin 2-hex range. However, it is actually best to position him in the front line. The reason for this is, on Fiddlesticks ult, it says teleport into the largest cluster of enemies and stun them for 1.25 seconds. What this means is we want Fiddlesticks to ult or have a chance to ult the enemy's backline carries. When you position Fiddlesticks in hex in the B file, which is the second file from the front, he cannot reach the backline with the fear portion of his spell, unless he like somehow walks up a hex upon the fight beginning, which can happen, but it is very rare. So if you start him in the second hex, he will be unable to reach the enemy backline. However, moving him up just 1 hex will allow him on the initial cast to just teleport and fear the enemy backline, which is really what you want to do with his ability. Obviously, Fiddlesticks can do a ton of damage, so kind of either way, if you have the right items on him, he will still do a lot of damage. But being able to teleport right into this range and fearing the enemy backline, or if it's here, he has a chance to teleport right into the backline here. And being able to do that really gets the most out of Fiddlesticks' ability. Another thing to know with Fiddlesticks is he is a magic assassin, so, and you would prefer him not to be getting focus first, similar to Ornn. So in that case, similar to Ornn when he doesn't really have items and you just want him to cast. In this case, you again would prefer to have units to the left and to the right of Fiddlesticks protecting him. Ideally, units of the tank class who are meant to draw the aggro of any enemy units targeting this area. That way, he doesn't get focused down super quickly, and he gets the chance to do a lot of damage, or even cast a single time, depending. Because, like, let's imagine the scenario where you leave him on the outside all alone, and then the enemy has a Yunara 2 in the upper left corner. Just imagine they have a Yunara 2 with like 3 items, and she just lasers down the Fiddlesticks before it even gets the chance to cast. That is exactly what you don't want to happen. So by putting 1 or 2 tanks to the left of him, that will prevent this from happening. So that is usually what you want to think about when positioning Fiddlesticks. All right, next we have Shyvana. In general, Shyvana positioning is not super important. I would say the most important thing is to just put her in the front, make sure she's autoing a target as soon as possible, because you want her to cast as fast as possible. This is because of her unique trait, which is Dragonborn. Sorry, I have so many traits up here, but oh, sorry, it's down here. It's Dragonborn, which is once she casts, she transforms, and then all allies take less damage from enemy abilities, which is such a powerful effect, such a huge board-wide buff. And getting access to that as fast as possible in the late game fights is super impactful. So as a result, like I said, she is generally a tanky unit, especially if you're playing Juggernaut, and she won't die before casting, even if you put her on the outside, kind of unlike Fiddlesticks. But in general, I think it's still a good principle because she is not a tank, and especially if you have damage items on her, it's good to keep her a little bit protected, just to make sure that she gets the chance to, after transforming, she gets the chance to dish out a bit of damage. So that's generally what you want to be thinking about with Shyvana, but in general, just put her in the front and make sure she's autoing something immediately, so that way she can cast as soon as possible. All right, next we have Annie and Tibbers. Let's see if I can find Tibbers here. Okay, it looks like Tibbers is a separate unit down here. So, all right, so Annie and Tibbers is pretty simple. I would say Annie is just a traditional backliner. I think that you just want to position her safe. I think in a general okay principle is putting her opposite side of the enemy backline carry. So if the enemy has their Lucian and Senna in the upper right corner, I think it's generally safe to put her in the bottom left because of how long it takes her to cast her spell. She is a 170 mana unit, meaning if she gets under any threat in the beginning of the fight, it can be very scary if she gets the chance to be targeted early on. So I think generally keeping her safe away from the enemy carry is a good, solid principle. The next thing to think about is Tibbers, because Tibbers does have a bit to think about as well. So once you hit your Annie 2 and you're putting tank items on Tibbers, I'm just going to throw on 3 miscellaneous items. Doesn't really matter for the purposes of this video. Let's say this is your Tibbers build, and we really want to understand what Tibbers exactly does and what his spell is. So his active is he gains a bunch of attack speed and a huge shield that decays over 4 seconds. He also gains immunity to crowd control effects for the same duration. So not only does he gain attack speed, he also gains like a huge shield. However, this attack speed also converts into tankiness for himself, because we'll read the passive: after attacking an enemy, restore health. If they are burning, the healing is doubled. What this means is, generally, I would say a general principle is you don't want your Tibbers dying immediately or taking aggro right away. The reason for that is because you don't want him to die before Annie casts, because once Annie casts, she will burn the entire board for the rest of the fight, meaning Tibbers can really pop off at that time because of how his passive works, where he will double the healing if they are burning. So you're kind of relying on your Annie to get her cast off before Tibbers really comes online and really becomes a tanky monster that is really difficult to take down. So I mean, obviously you don't have to be so afraid that like you move him back or something like that. And I wouldn't overthink it too much. But in general, I think that if you can, like putting like 1 or 2 units, drawing the aggro first, and just giving him a slight buffer while Annie builds up mana and then eventually gets the cast, that's generally a good idea, because you do want your Tibbers to be healthy. That way he, by the time Annie casts, because that way he can get the most out of this passive, right? The double healing passive while enemies are burned. So that's generally what you want to be thinking about with Annie and Tibbers. Okay, next we have Azir. I would say Azir, similar to Annie, you just want to keep him safe. You just want to keep him safe from threats such as big AoEs, like Swain, Fiddlesticks, we talked about already. Even things like Sett or I mean, I'm trying to think of other, maybe like melee carries like Tryndamere or Baron Nashor or Bel'Veth, things like that. So try to be positioning him behind, generally behind your tank, and also just on the safe side can be a generally good idea, especially if you have like a ramping build where he can pop off really late into the fight. And then also the Sand Soldiers pretty much just serve as frontline. I don't think it's really a big deal. I don't think you have to overthink it too much. I'd say in general, a good principle is if the enemy has their carry, let's just imagine it's a Kindred in this case. If it's a Kindred 2 in the upper left corner, I think generally your Sand Soldiers, putting them both on that side is good, because that way you just make sure that they're tanking effective damage and they are getting as much value as possible, and also tanking before your other units die. So again, this is like where like Fiddlesticks could come back into play. Putting Fiddlesticks to the right of the two Sand Soldiers. This way, Kindred has to get through the Sand Soldiers before aggroing onto the Fiddlesticks. That's like generally the idea and where all these concepts might tie together. But in general, not much else to Azir's spell. I mean, he just does damage. He summons soldiers and is a good single target damage dealer. So I would say just generally keeping him safe is an important principle to keep in mind. All right, next we have Zilean. Zilean is another yet another backline carrier where generally keeping him safe is a good idea. So obviously what safe means can vary depending on the fight and who you are fighting and what units you are playing versus the enemy board is playing. So it is all contextual and variable based on the context of the fight. However, Zilean does have some other use cases, and that is in his spell, which is if a time bomb is on an enemy for 18 seconds at 1 star or 16 seconds at 2 star, and Zilean is alive, the enemy instantly dies. So what this means in really long drawn out fights, especially when your Zilean isn't the primary carry, I think that Zilean can see play with like Annie. He can also see play on like Invoker boards with like Lysandra and Volibear, that type of Freljord Invoker variant. Actually positioning him to snipe the enemy carry, like let's say you just have let's say you have your 3 items on Annie and then you're working towards Zilean items and he just has 1 item at the time. Trying to snipe the enemy tank immediately on the first cast is often a pretty good use for him, because if the fight is really drawn out, that execute could really come into play. So an example of this would be let's just say that the enemy is playing a frontline of 4 units. And you notice that this is their main tank, and it looks pretty isolated, and there's a way for your Zilean to try to target it immediately, then positioning the Zilean right in front of it to make sure that the highest to ensure for the highest chance that he casts immediately onto the enemy tank, and then again gets that ticking time going, is usually the way you want to go about positioning him, because again, sometimes the execute can really come into play if the fight does last long enough. So trying to snipe, in conclusion, like trying to snipe high priority enemy frontline units is usually a good way to position him. All right, so that will be all about Zilean. Next, we have Lucian and Senna. All right, so Lucian and Senna in general is very good in the corners. This is because he or they with the Senna cast, they snipe the furthest enemy target, meaning you can often snipe the enemy corner carry by putting Lucian Senna in the corner. Another idea is that when they're in the corner, they also tend to shield. From what I've noticed, they tend to shield more of your units. So sometimes, like if you put the Lucian in this corner, or the Senna in this corner, when she ults and shields your team, it can often hit like your corner units. It can also hit this unit if you have a, let's just say, for example, you have a Yunara standing next to it. It can shield the Yunara for sure. Whereas even if you reverse it, if you put Lucian here and they ult and Senna ults over here, it won't shield the unit to the right of it very often, unless it might be the case where Lucian can shield the Yunara if he ults up here. But I think that is rare, and I'm honestly not certain if that works, because that is pretty uncommon. Normally the Senna will be ulting into the opposite side corner, because that will be the furthest enemy away. So for that reason, I think in general you just really want to keep them in the corner. If your main carries Yunara and you want to put them in the corner, then you can just put Lucian Senna in the other corner. Like that, like that's like an interest. That's like a fine. That's like a fine way to position it. Or if you don't really think you need the shield on Yunara, which will be the case for a lot of the time, you can just like put the Lucian Senna next to Yunara, and it's really not that big of a deal. Lucian's ult is very powerful. That is like the true like damage dealing part of the Lucian Senna like combo. Like obviously Senna can do damage with her cast, but the real DPS and single also just single target like damage comes from Lucian's spell. So he will fire shots towards the target. Each shot explodes on the first enemy hit, dealing damage, and he will also drain armor from them. So in general, I would say like if the enemy, this is very important, where if the enemy has like a melee carry such as Tryndamere or Bel'Veth or things like that that can be vulnerable to Lucian's cast, I think trying to put the Lucian Senna to the same side as that threat is important, because very often the Lucian can just laser them down super early into the fight, which could give you a huge advantage. But yeah, otherwise in general, I mean, a general principle with all the backliners is just keeping them in the corner will generally be a very easy and safe default. All right. And now we have the final unlockable, which is Kindred. I think Kindred is yet another backliner where the corner is often a good place to put her. However, Kindred, there is a bit more to think about because of how her spell works. So when Kindred uses her spell, she creates a zone, and then which prevents enemy allies from dying. But also, another very important of her spell is while active, double her current attack speed, and on attack, fire a secondary arrow at a nearby enemy that deals physical damage. Basically, she's going to be doing her maximum DPS while she's in her ult. So because of this, it's a very, very important for Kindred, more so than any other unit, more so than let's say like Annie, for example. Her only opportunity to do like serious damage is when she's ulting. I mean, she can still do pretty good DPS with her passive, which is Eternal, meaning when she's not casting, she still does pretty good DPS, but a lot of her damage does come from the cast. So you really want to try to make sure that Kindred is safe from CC, because if she ults in and then gets CC'd during the ult, you're going to lose out on a ton of the duration of her ult, and you will then lose out on a lot of DPS and also healing, because it says when the zone ends, heal all allies for a percentage of the damage dealt during that time. So a classic example of this is Skarner, which I have seen happen quite a few times actually. If you position the Kindred on the same side as Skarner, a lot of time what can happen is she might dash into like around here, or maybe even sometimes she dashes into here. This can happen to Kindred pretty often, and you don't really have like too much control over it. However, if she gets ulted by the Skarner during her ult, that is like really what you don't want to happen, right? Getting CC'd during the ult duration. So I think in general, trying to put her away from threats like that is like generally pretty good. But a lot of time you don't have like a ton of control over where she is going to ult, and it's kind of difficult to predict, admittedly. So yeah, just in general, keep her safe in the back, and maybe consider moving her away from CC threats like Swain, Skarner, Fiddlesticks, right? Like these like common stun units in the late game. All right, so that is going to be Kindred, and that is going to wrap up all of the base 5 costs, and now we're going to move on to unlockables. So first we have Thresh. Thresh is listed as a Warden, but he is actually a very potent damage dealer, and that is how he is supposed to be built. So for example, a build like Hodge, JG, BT might do a very good job, and you will notice he will do a ton of damage. So don't be deceived that he might be a tank just because he is a Warden. In general, you want to keep Thresh safe from getting aggro early on from enemy carries, because he is not super tanky when you build him like this. I mean, he can heal up a lot because he does. You do often build Omnivamp, and he does have this passive where heal for 50% of the damage dealt by his aura passive effect. However, I still think it's very important to be putting tanks on the side where the enemy carries are, because you want your Thresh to be getting focused last. That way he has the maximum uptime to do as much damage as possible. So if the enemy, again, I'm just going to be using like Kindred as an example. The enemy has a Kindred on the left side, I think, and that's their main damage DPS source. I think it's generally a good idea to put at least a tank or two to the left of Thresh, and vice versa. the enemy has their carry here, making sure that your strongest tank is to the right of Thresh is often the way to go. I think that's usually it about Thresh. He does have another effect where if there are less than 2 enemies inside the box at any time, drag an enemy in. So I do think that has preference towards like closer units, so maybe you could argue that like trying to keep him on the similar side of the enemy carry will give him more of a chance to pull them in if he gets the chance to. But I think in general this is like pretty rare that his that he like drags in the backliners and it like actually matters or actually makes a big difference, because usually the fight is decided before he gets the chance to like drag in enemy backliners. I think it's pretty rare, but admittedly, Thresh is not a unit I have played a ton. I mean, obviously, it's a pretty rare unit to find because it is gated behind having a Viego 2 out of the opener. But these are good things to think about nonetheless. And again, the most important principle will be to keep him safe and tucked away in between multiple tanks. All right, so that's Thresh positioning. Next, we have Volibear. So in general, when you're playing Volibear, a lot of time you're going to be playing something along the lines of like, let's just say Lissandra, and then I think another common unit is often like Sejuani. This sees play a lot on like Bruiser Rise boards. Also just general like Freljord / Quick Striker / Invoker Flex boards. It's possible. I think in general, Volibear prefers to be in the damage amp portion of the Frozen Tower, of the Freljord Frozen Tower. So keeping him, actually starting him behind the tower is often what you will see from the top players. And I think another important note is to place your strongest tank. So let's say your best tank is a Wukong 2, and I'm going to put the Sejuani back in for Freljord. Let's say your strongest tank is a Wukong 2. I think you want to position the Wukong and make sure it's drawing aggro from everything like on the left side of the board onto it immediately. And this is because, again, you want, for these melee damage carries, you really want your tank to be your best tank to be tanking for your carry as long as possible. That way, yes, Volibear is tanky and he can sustain quite a bit of damage. However, you would really prefer your Wukong to be tanking for him first, right? That way, Volibear has the most uptime as possible to do as much damage as possible and eventually like try to take over the fight like after, because he does need to cast 5 times on his initial spell before he transforms, leaps into the enemy team, and then increases DPS by a ton. So positioning something like this tends to be very good. And then another note is just be careful about putting other units, like Kabuko is another unit that's often seen on this board, like here, because if they have a DPS carry here and they blow through your Kabuko 1 or Kabuko 2 with no items really quickly, by then Volibear will be somewhere in this vicinity, and then after the Kindred makes quick work of this lesser tank, she will often start aggroing onto the Volibear because he is way closer than the Wukong. He's like clearly the closest target. So it can be very likely that Kindred will target the Volibear next. So because of that, if you need to put a unit on like the left side, let's say, I would actually prefer to drop it back just to make sure that Kindred starts the fight on Wukong. And that way, Wukong will tank, and then Volibear will be able to do his thing. If you need to swap sides, a similar idea will be just moving him to the right. You might move your backline carry to the right as well, and then putting Wukong here, and then dropping any other additional tanks like back down to here. So hopefully that makes sense. And again, this will be in the case for the enemy as a Kindred in the upper right corner. Okay, so that's generally what you want to think about with Volibear. Next, we're going to talk about the T-Hex. So I would say a general principle, I mean, I think pretty much 100% of the time, maybe you could say like 99% of the time, you would prefer to have the T-Hex on the far left or the far right of the B row. So B1 or B7. This is just because it creates the most favorable positions for him to get really high impact and high value ultimates. Also, another note, which is very important, is make sure to keep your strongest tank like in A6. So that could often be Loris or Braum. Something like A6 or maybe A5 is acceptable. Maybe even A7 is fine. But just be sure to be putting your best tanks in front of the T-Hex and trying to tank for him as long as possible. But yes, and just generally keeping them to the edge of the board, like a carry like the T-Hex is good because it keeps them safe from it keeps them in general safer from getting CC'd, or a little bit safer from getting CC'd or getting like targeted a lot of time. But I think the main reason you want to put it towards the edge is because it creates the most favorable angles for his ult most of the time. Okay, next we want to talk about Aatrox. Aatrox is actually a unit that you want to die. So unlike Fiddlesticks, where we talked about how you want to be protecting him with tanks to either side of him, depending on where the enemy carry is, it's actually okay for Aatrox to die early on. And what I mean by this is you can put him all the way to the edge of the board and intentionally have him draw aggro from the enemies. So like, again, I'm going to use Kindred again, who is just a DPS AD carry, because of his passive, which is World Ender. And what World Ender does is, the top portion isn't super relevant, but on first death, he becomes briefly untargetable and heals back to full health over 2 seconds. Afterwards, he reduces his maximum mana by 20 and gains 20% durability. So you want Aatrox to turn into this form as soon as possible, because what you never want to happen is Aatrox being one of the last, like pretty much the last unit alive, and then he hasn't died throughout the entire fight, and then when he's the last unit alive, he goes into his World Ender status stasis where he is reviving, and he's invincible for a brief time. But then once he comes out of that form and begins to become targetable again, if he's the last unit standing, he won't get the chance to pop off because he's just going to get lasered down so hard by like the entire enemy board. So you actually want him to be activating early on to the fight, because yes, he will die at the initial time, but then he will revive to full HP, come back stronger, and then while you're at like let's say you place a Taric here and you put your Aatrox here. I think like Aatrox is a pretty rare unit to play these days, but one example would be like on like a Slayer board, right? So then you could think about putting Bel'Veth here behind. What will happen is the Kindred will go for the Aatrox first. She'll proc the World Ender, and then she will get aggroed onto the Taric. And then after the Aatrox goes untargetable, she will start hitting the Taric, and then your Aatrox will revive, and then your Bel'Veth and Aatrox will kind of have a lot of time to do a lot of work, basically. And Aatrox will be able to get the most value possible out of his kit. So yeah, like I said, Aatrox is not like super meta right now, but I'm sure sometime during the set he will be buffed and he will be super strong. So trying to remember this concept of him, preferring him to die actually early on into the fight is very, very important. Okay. Next, we have Galio. Galio, honestly, I probably shouldn't have even put in here, but he just kind of sits on your bench and there's not really anything you can do about like positioning him. So not at least to my understanding so far. So I don't think you have to like put too much thought into this one. Okay, next is Sett, and Sett is very similar to Aatrox in many ways. So Sett has a passive called the Boss, where once he drops below 45% max health, he leaves combat to start doing sit-ups. Each sit-up restores the health and gives him 60% attack speed and move speed. If he reaches full health, he returns to combat pumped up, converting all damage from his attacks and abilities to true damage. If all of his allies die, he immediately returns to combat. So, Sett getting focused first is incredibly important. Probably even more so than Aatrox, honestly. I mean, that could potentially be because of how strong Sett is and how kind of like Aatrox's comps aren't the best right now. But Sett is, you really want to get focused as soon as possible, because it's similar to Aatrox in the sense that you never want Sett to be one of the last ones to die, because then what will happen is like let's say the Kindred is in the upper left corner and she kills all of your tanks on the left side, and then Sett is your last frontliner alive. The Sett will then like drop to 45%, run back to do sit-ups in the bottom right corner. He might do like 1 or 2 sit-ups, but then the rest of your board will die, and then he'll come back, and then he won't be able to go into the pumped up state. And also he won't have any tanks to tank for him while he can do the most damage, right? So because of that, you would really prefer to have him get lasered down by a DPS unit in A1 or A7 is often common, because you want him to drop to 45% early on. That way he can do all the sit-ups, get into the pumped up state, and then come back when your frontline is still alive, And then he will do a ton of damage while the Kindred is still having to deal with, like, let's say your Wukong or your Skarner or whatever it may be, and he will be able to get the most value as possible. One very important thing to think about is with roles revamped, the tanks, the units class is tanks, so Garen's an attack tank, Braum is a magic tank, Terra is a magic tank, Wukong is an attack tank. You don't want to put one of these next to Sett most of the time, because what will happen then is if the enemy Kindred is here, they will actually hit the Wukong first. So that's why I have this positioning as like a general decent default, because you put like let's say you put your Yunara in D7, and then you put your best tank, so it could be like a Wukong or even like a Skarner, which is pretty commonly played, in let's say like A5. That way, what will happen is you won't run the risk of this unit actually hitting the Skarner first, and instead you will guarantee that this corner is going to hit Sett initially. He will go back to do push-ups, and then the Kindred will then start hitting your best tanks. So let's just say it happens to be a Skarner 2 with like a Bramble Vest, which is like incredibly tanky. And then hopefully by the time your Sett comes back, your Kindred will still be hitting the Skarner, or maybe she'll have killed the Skarner and start hitting the Wukong, something along those lines. And then Sett will come back while Wukong is tanking for the tanking the Kindred's aggro. He'll come back and be able to do his thing, do a ton of damage. So that is generally how you want to think about positioning Sett. All right, and we're coming down to our last few units. So next we have Ziggs. Admittedly, Ziggs is not a unit I have played a ton. However, I think his spell is pretty self-explanatory. You pretty much just do damage, do a bit of damage with autos, and then your active just throws a big bomb towards the largest clump of enemies. I don't really think that there's not too much to positioning this guy besides keeping him safe and making sure that he can get his cast off and do his damage, similar to like Annie type unit. So keeping him away from CC will be a good fundamental as well, but I don't think there's much more to it, at least at the time of recording this video. Okay, and next we have Xerath. So Xerath does have some nuance. I think that Xerath, you often prefer to have him on the same side of the enemy backline carry or melee carry. The reason for that is his spell will hit the 4 closest enemies. It'll randomly split Arcane Blast between the 4 closest enemies. Very often what can happen, and this has happened to me, is if the enemy has their carry here and Xerath is in this corner parallel to the enemy carry. Then what can happen is after a lot of the initial frontline units die on the left side, enemy frontline units, let's say you have an Azir as well, because obviously Xerath is classically played with Azir. If the Azir is able to kill like 2 or 3 of the frontliners, then Xerath will very often get the chance to just directly ult to, like, he will see the enemy corner as one of the closest units, and then thus he will get the chance to hit them with his spell. And Xerath's spell does a ton of damage. It's not really meant for backliners to tank. So if he even gets the chance to hit 1 or 2 blasts on the enemy carry, that can often be enough to have a huge impact on the fight, if not even kill them, depending on if your Xerath has like a really like high damage build. So like something like, you know, JG, Shoujin, Strikers, whatever it may be, right? So for that reason, I think putting him opposite of the enemy backline carry is very, very good. And similarly, if you're positioning against him and you notice that there's a player who's just been planting their Xerath in the upper left corner for pretty much the entire game, I think it would be a really good idea to try to put your carries away from that and try to put as many units as possible in between Xerath and your carry to try to reduce the chance that he ults your backline. All right, so that is what you want to think about with Xerath. Next is Mel. Mel has a few things about her spell. So first, her passive is while gaining mana, you throw out 2 radiant orbs that orbit around the target. I believe the first one comes out around 30%, like 33% mana, and the second one comes out around 66% mana, like roughly. I don't know the exact value, but it seems like they come out based on how much mana she has built up. They deal magic damage in a 1-hit radius around the target and drain mana for any hit each second, and then her active is detonate orbs on a target, causing a 3-hex radius explosion that deals a ton of damage. It's like a huge nuke, right? Mel has a really high mana cost, so building like multiple mana items on her is very good. So there are two ways you can go about positioning her. I think the first way, as a general good default, is putting her towards the middle of the board. This is because when you put her in the middle, she will generally be hitting the most units possible with the active portion of her ability, where she will be causing the 3-hex radius explosion, and that will very often hit most the hexes that I'm lighting up in the with my cursor. I think they very commonly will get hit, and she can hit all of this. Whereas if you put her towards the edge, she might hit like a smaller portion, right? For example, if she tosses out an orb, let's just say the enemy has a ton of frontliners, which is often pretty common in Sett. If she tosses out an orb to this unit and the orbs are rotating around here, she loses some value and some damage from her spell, right? Because when it detonates, it might reach to here roughly, but it is certainly not going. It is certainly very often not going to reach all the way to the left of the board. Whereas if you put her here, I think it's very likely she's going to be hitting more units, right? And then another thing you can do though by putting Mel at the side of the board is if the enemy has a really durable like tank on the all the way on the edge, or yeah, like typically it's all the way on the edges on 1 and 7 in the enemy row, enemy first row. She can actually hit the backline with her detonation. So what I mean by that is, let's say the enemy has the Lux and that is their primary carry. If Mel detonates an orb that is around this area, it will hit the Lux, and very often that can be enough to kill the enemy carry. If not kill them, again, it's similar to Xerath, where it will do a ton of damage and maybe it will die to some other miscellaneous like source of damage. So for that reason, if you think that you have to win by blowing up the enemy carry immediately, like very quickly, I think that putting Mel on the edges of the board and trying to get her to hit the tank in the 1 or 7 hex, and then thus getting the chance to detonate and kill the enemy corner carry, I think that is probably the way to go. So that's usually like the two approaches to positioning Mel. Okay, so I think that I covered all of them except for Kench, right? I just want to make sure. Kench is going to be the last one. Okay, so Kench. Kench is interesting. So he is classified as a magic tank. However, you'll notice his ability doesn't really give him a lot of tankiness. He gets most of his tankiness from the fact that he's a bruiser, also from the fact that he has the passive Glutton, where you can feed him, and over time you can give him a lot of HP from that. So he can definitely get very tanky and durable. And so as a result, especially if you have bought some of the tank Bilgewater items such as Pilo Citrus or Barnacles, I believe this is Barnacles, yeah. If you have like these types of items on him, and then maybe you just like happen to have a Bramble Vest, then he can just do a good job at tanking damage, and it kind of is what it is. However, even though he can take a lot of damage, you will notice if I look at the Tahm Kench stats, I'm just going to do a straight up Tahm Kench with 3-item filter. His best items are often, I'm actually going to exclude some of the, I'm going to exclude the Barnacles and the Pilo Citrus. Oh, sorry, I forgot, I have to do here. Okay, it's not okay. For some reason, there's probably a way to do it, but I'm not gonna look at it right now. That's kind of like my fault for not knowing exactly how it works. But you will notice like a lot of his good items are actually damage items. If we look at craftables, so Helm and Blue Buff to get him to cast quicker. Crown Guard is like a pseudo damage, pseudo tank item. Again, you'll see like the tank items are completely fine. Ionis Spark is fine. Protector's Vow. Building things like Edge of Night is acceptable. A healing item can be good, like a Bloodthirster or a Gunblade. So if you have him built like that, is what I'm trying to say. So let's say you don't have extra tank items to put on him, and you have your tank items on someone else, and as a result, you put damage items on Kench. I think it's very important to have him protected, kind of similar to Thresh, similar to Volibear, similar to Fiddlesticks, right? We can kind of see how this is kind of a similar principle for a lot of the melee units. have him protected from enemy aggro, because you want him to be able to get a lot of casts. Like you want him to get the chance to cast like 2-3 times throughout the fight and get a ton of value. You know, the job of the tanks is to tank damage, right? And if your carry is a melee carry, it's very important to try to put in the effort to try to protect them. So let's just say you happen to have a build like this, like whatever, blue buff BT Crown Guard, which seems like a fine build. And the enemy has their Kindred in the upper left corner. Again, we're just going to use this as the classic example. Then putting your tank, such as Nautilus or Braum or Ornn is like another example in this comp. Like having them tanking for your Tahm at the beginning is important. Another thing to think about is you want your Kench to eat the enemy tank, because he will devour them and then take away their ability to tank damage for a little bit. So this means that your damage dealers will get the chance to very often just get access to higher priority targets faster. So if the enemy has let's say their main tank happens to be a Taric, and then they have a lot of lesser units, very often it could be Swain by Nico. I'm just really improvising this, but this is a very common front line you might see with Diana boards or Mel boards or stuff like that. And let's just say they happen to be positioning like this, maybe they have exiles or something. Intentionally placing the Kench in front of the Taric is going to be very good most of the time. The same can be true for enemy melee carries. So I think a good example of one that I have seen is Tryndamere. So with Tryndamere, how they position a lot of time is the following. So they will often put their tower on let's say they put their tower on the edge of the board, they have their action in the back. They will be getting the damage amp portion from the Freljord. So they might put Tryndamere here, and they'll put their best tank here. Let's say it happens to be a Sejuani 3. One viable option is definitely to just eat the Sejuani, and you can't really go wrong with Kench eating the tank. It just often opens up a lot of opportunities for the rest of your team. But another option is if you can predict that the Tryndamere is going to walk up to this hex, what you can do is you can put Kench somewhere towards the edge of the board, and then maybe you could even put him back a row, right? Just depending on the enemy board, depending on your board. Because if the Tryndamere walks up here, and the Kench gets the chance to just walk up and begin ulting the Tryndamere and just do a ton of damage to it, that can be yet another way to go about it. Especially because Tryndamere often builds Quicksilver, Titans, CC immunity items. That means the Kench, because you'll see, if they are immune to crowd control, he does extra, he will... Oh no, sorry, he doesn't deal extra damage, but he still deals a ton of damage, and getting him to ult the enemy target and doing a huge burst of damage can often just win you the fight, right? So this can be the case with a Quicksilver unit. It could be the case, I've seen it be the case with Baron before. I've seen it be the case with Brock, who are just these units are naturally CC immune. So Kench can be really good at just bursting those types of units as well. So that's yet another use for his ultimate, besides ulting just high priority frontline units. Okay. So I think that was all the 5 costs, and hopefully I did a good job of kind of explaining how to get the maximum value out of each of their spells. I don't know, maybe in the future I will do the lower cost units. If there's any units or costs that you want me to cover specifically, let me know about that in the comments below. But otherwise, thank you guys so much for watching. I am pretty much streaming every day or every other day on twitch.tv/junglebook1_. That will all be in the description. And otherwise, take care, and I will see you all soon. Peace.